Hello everyone. My name is Charlotte Weatherill. I'm a lecturer in the Politics International Studies department, where I'm part of the teaching teams developing some new international relations modules. And today I'm presenting on some theory I've been developing to understand climate in action. And the paper is called Colonial Fantasies of Invulnerability to Climate Change, and it's currently working its way through peer review. So the main contribution I make in this article is the argument that fantasies of invulnerability are at least a partial explanation for why the colonial powers or Europe and its settler colonies have not taken any positive, meaningful action on preventing climate change. And answering this question of why there has not been action is my overarching research interest. It's the question that sent me to university as a mature student 10 years ago, and it's the question that sits over all my research, but this article is addressing it explicitly. So today I have 4 key ideas that I would like to get across that draw on my research into vulnerability. And on this slide, I will outline the argument in brief, and then I will slow it down and talk in more detail about the 3 fantasies of invulnerability that I have identified in climate politics. So firstly, at a basic level, the vulnerable in climate politics are the people in regions that are widely expected to be badly affected. So vulnerability is an imagined line drawn to separate what and who is expected to be in danger and what and who is expected to be safe. This line is, of course, extremely political, as these expectations then lead to decisions about what lies inside the idea of vulnerability and whether that is worth saving. And I argue that much of the reason for lack of action on climate change is because this line of safety and unsafety is drawn around a racialized and feminized group of people and places where risk and danger is already expected to be. So secondly, there is a binary between the invulnerable masculine subject of climate politics and the vulnerable feminized and racialized object of climate research. And this binary applies both to people and the personification of or imaginative construction of states themselves. Thirdly, then, this perception of vulnerability as other is deeply embedded in dominant climate politics and European thought, which, due to the dominance of European and US authorship in climate research, amounts much to the same thing. So the fantasy of invulnerability is deeply embedded and violently protected, as I'll argue shortly. And climate change should challenge this perception of invulnerability, but so far it hasn't. And then my final point, and the one which I think is very important to include, is that against these fantasies are the counter-narratives and activism of anti-colonial feminist resistances. And this resistance exists. It produces work and politics and activism and art. And if talking about vulnerability without also looking at this resistance, it's extremely difficult to escape the discursive traps of vulnerability and their paternalist and victimizing political responses. So for the remainder of my time, I'm going to focus on these climate fantasies of invulnerability and feminist resistance to these narratives. So in my article, I identify 3 fantasies of invulnerability that structure climate politics: the fantasy of modernity, the fantasy of mastery, and the fantasy of continentalism. This work follows the tradition of feminist and critical theory that has spoken of invulnerability as a fantasy, a fiction, or a delusion. And the language of fantasy is used by Judith Butler, whose work on vulnerability has been really important to my research. By drawing attention to vulnerabilization, Butler's work is able to show how vulnerability is simultaneously a materially produced condition and also a discourse that can be wielded to justify victimizing and paternalistic politics. And in the same way, I'm arguing that while some limited and conditional invulnerability can be produced through wealth and adaptation, invulnerability is also a set of discursive fantasies that are wielded to justify the continued politics of colonial violence and domination that is driving climate change. So the 3 fantasies that I identify in this article are all what Butler calls first worldisms. And these are fantasies that are reliant on masculine rejections of vulnerability. And this rejection is violent, as seen with the US response to the confrontation of vulnerability that was the September 11th attack. So confrontation with vulnerability from the supposedly invulnerable provokes fear and is to be banished in the name of action. First world fantasies are therefore violent and reliant on masculinist ideas of sovereign manhood and a natural world void of other people. So this is a rejection of interdependence that is not only masculine, it's colonial. And these fantasies that I draw out of mastery, modernity, and continentalism all reproduce this masculine colonial fear of vulnerability in different ways. So of these three fantasies, the first two draw on familiar critical theory. Firstly, the fantasy of modernity is the assumption of a universal and linear development path that supposedly leads to becoming European, civilized, and therefore safe. This fantasy is found in arguments that vulnerability is a condition of not being sufficiently developed, and that development leads to invulnerability. And what this fantasy denies is that this invulnerability of Europeanness is only a partial safety, and one that can only be achieved through imperialism, mass exploitation, and marginalization. It therefore cannot be replicated globally. Secondly, the fantasy of mastery relies on assumptions that technology can overcome any obstacle to achieving perpetual domination over nature. Invulnerability can be created according to this fantasy through overcoming the reliance on a livable environment and non-renewable resources. The fantasy is that technology, development, carbon removal, wealth, or whiteness can defeat the human reliance on a livable earth. And then finally, the fantasy of continentalism is a little bit harder to summarize, but essentially I have drawn this fantasy from the language of Teresia Tewa, who wrote a short piece in 2007, which I'm going to put on screen but paraphrase. Let us island the world. Let us teach the inhabitants of planet Earth how to behave as if we were all living on islands. The islanded must understand that to live long and well, they need to take care. Care for other humans, care for plants, animals, care for soil, care for water. Once islanded, humans are awakened from the stupor of continental fantasies. So this fantasy relies on a colonial othering of islands that's discussed extensively in both island studies and Pacific studies. And this fantasy is a racialized and environmentally deterministic fantasy, where the vulnerable island is tropical, it's small and uninhabitable, and it's populated by savages. And the fantasy relies on an imagined binary of continents, of endless space and resources to be conquered and settled according to imperial logics of manifest destiny and frontierism, versus the islands that are not real places of habitation, that are only sources of resources or strategic outposts for military bases. And the fantasy is particularly visible in the case of the UK, itself an island state, yet an imagined global continent where its language and overseas territories spread across the world in a legacy of empire. So in opposition to this view, I argue for the feminist notion of vulnerability to replace accepted binaries of the invulnerable subject and the vulnerable other with a more relational conceptualization. And in my work, I start with the feminist theory done by people such as Alemo, Butler, and Gilson, which is not directly addressing environmental vulnerability. I then turn to the work of Pacific scholars, activists, and artists, and in particular feminists, and in particular anti-colonial feminists, such as Hanani K. Trask and Teresia Tewa, to build on this and locate resistance to the dominant frame of climate vulnerability in the place where the discursive politics play out most violently. So the theoretical problem this work has helped me answer, that I took from Butler's co-edited 2016 book on vulnerability and resistance, was how to find a way to discuss vulnerability that created neither a victimizing nor a paternalistic politics. So I'm going to make 3 short points and then I'll finish. And just to say, these are not all of it, these are just 3 points I picked out to make today. But a feminist idea of vulnerability, 1, sees vulnerability as physical and an unavoidable part of being human and living on a living planet. You cannot defeat it, but it can be exacerbated through violent, vulnerabilizing processes such as changing the climate. 2, vulnerability is relational and draws attention to our interdependence. COVID and the war in Ukraine should have pierced this invulnerable fantasy of sovereign mastery or the bounded spatiality of violence. Feminists are well placed to argue that this is not how violence works. The people of the global north are not safe from climate change in any meaningful way. Life on Earth is too interconnected. Food systems and energy systems all require a level of mutual safety. And the world would not be unchanged if islands become uninhabitable. And then finally, climate justice needs to be pursued as an historically informed internationalist project that is anti-colonial, that returns stolen land to Indigenous peoples and the working class, that demands reparations and that refuses an adaptation-only pathway. So to conclude, I've argued that vulnerability is a key concept in climate change coloniality. Feminist work on vulnerability therefore needs to address both how and where vulnerability is being produced, and also the discursive framework that is used to justify and naturalize this vulnerabilization. The discursive framework itself relies on first world fantasies of invulnerability that have allowed the imagined safety of the developed world to justify a politics pathway of adaptation, allowing the violence to continue due to its expected distribution. And I'll leave it there. So thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlotte. That's great. So I think it's time to move on to our next presentation. And we have Sophie-Grace Chappell. Are you there? There we are. Lovely.
Hi.
Okay, thank you. All yours.
Thank you, George. So can everyone hear me? Unless anyone objects, I'll assume the answer to that is yes. So I want to say a few things just to introduce my own research in this area and what it has to say about the environmental crisis that we face and what we might succeed in doing about that crisis and why at the moment we're failing so badly. I don't have a handout. I'm going to be referring to a number of things I've written, and the main thing I'm going to be referring to is this book, which I can't get to. Isn't that amazing? It doesn't appear on the camera. It's like it doesn't exist. There we are. And when it does appear, the wording on it is back to front. But what that should say is Epiphanies, which is a book by me which came out in 2022. And Epiphanies is about an experience that I think is central to our moral growth and our moral understanding, and which I don't believe is at all adequately picked up by most current moral theories which we study in universities. So, as you may or may not know, the main moral theories that we study in universities these days are virtue ethics, consequentialism, and Kantianism or deontology. So broadly speaking, we have an approach which says the right thing to do is whatever brings about the best consequences. That's consequentialism. Or we have an approach which says the right thing to do is whatever you can rationally will as being a way of contributing to a world where everyone else is trying to rationally will whatever can contribute to that world where everyone else is rational, etc., etc. In the Kantian picture, an important part of what's going on is just that recursion, just that constant reference in your own willing to other agents who are also willing. So you get, on the Kantian view, a kind of community of willers who are working together on the world to express their own being and, with any luck, to make things better. That's the second option. Alongside consequentialism, that's mainly discussed, that's routinely discussed in university courses, including the OU's university course. We've just had a revamp by the very splendid Sean Cordell of our teaching on ethics. And the third approach is virtue ethics, which is an approach which is closely associated with someone who, there may be people in this room, there are people in this room who actually had her as a colleague, the redoubtable Rosalind Hursthouse, now retired, was one of the world's leading contributors to the approach, the third approach, which is called virtue ethics, which is to say the right thing to do is whatever is in accord with the virtues. Now, in my book Epiphanies, I'm kind of opposing all three of these approaches to moral theory for a number of reasons. The first reason is because they are moral theories. And I'm someone who believes that in ethics, we have to start with human experience. We have to start with how things actually are for us. And I think it should be at least an open question whether our experience can be organized into a tidy single theory. And as a matter of fact, my own answer to that question in the book and elsewhere is very much, no, it can't be organised into a single tidy theory, and we shouldn't even try. And it's kind of Procrustean. It's kind of a mistake to try and squeeze our ethical experience into the mold of any one theory. So the subtitle of Epiphanies is, it's Epiphanies, an ethics of experience. And I won't make a second attempt to get the book up because it was a disaster last time. You just have to put up with me and the sinking Titanic behind me as your visuals. So where does that leave us? What's the alternative? What should we be doing if not moral theory? And what do I want to do about the moral theories that I've just cavalierly discarded, all of them? And what do I want to do with the whole idea of moral systematizing and moral theory? Well, the first thing I want to say, the first positive thing I want to say is that it's a striking fact. It was what got me going on writing the book Epiphanies. It's a striking fact that moral theory, as usually organized, doesn't have any place for what I call epiphanies. And in calling them that, I'm just following James Joyce in some of his writings and a number of other authors and thinkers, mainly in English departments, mainly not in philosophy departments, who have understood what I think is crucial, which is that central to the way we should think about what's valuable and what we should do in the world should be our ethical experience, should be our experience of the world as charged with value. And central to that experience is the occurrence of what I call epiphanies, following Joyce. Epiphanies are experiences which you might call wow moments or peak moments. They're moments where we come face to face with value in the world and where we are overwhelmed by it or moved to a new understanding of the world. And I think, why have philosophers neglected epiphanies? I think one reason is because philosophers are often fixated on a certain vision of rationality, which they take to be a very cool and disengaged thing. And what happens if you make epiphanies central to your ethical thinking, as I want to, is that you get a very engaged picture and a very emotionally laden picture, because we're talking about the things that we care about most. It seems to me that that's crucial, and that's exactly how things should be. But in this, I'm something of a heretic in contemporary ethics. I'm somewhat outside the mainstream of philosophy, of philosophical ethics. So what do I think we should do with the moral theories we've got? Well, my approach can sound like I'm simply trying to stop the game. I'm simply trying to say, you're all wrong, stop it. And that's not exactly what's going on at all. I'm certainly saying there isn't one systematic theory which will capture everything, but I'm not saying we shouldn't use consequentialist moves and Kantian moves and virtue ethical moves at certain points in the game. The point is not that we can't play those games. The point is, first of all, that they are games. They're not entirely serious approaches to what is of most value to us, or at least they're often not entirely serious in the way they're deployed. And secondly, that each of them is just an approach. It's just a possible heuristic that we can use to try and understand what's around us. It doesn't, it's not the one ring to rule them all. It's not the only game in town. It's not the only approach. So whenever we go to look at what consequentialists or Kantians or virtue ethicists or any other kind of moral theorist have to tell us, whenever we go to what they have to tell us, we should go in the spirit of, well, that's what this advisor says, but it is actually what I think is right. That's the output that we get if we think about the problem this way. But is that the right way to go, actually? So I can't resist the anecdote of the professor. I tell this in another of my books, Knowing What to Do, in chapter 1 of Knowing What to Do, anecdote about a professor of Bayesianism and consequentialism and rational game theory, who's padding around the college grounds at lunchtime looking really pensive, and his friend comes up and says, "Hey, what's eating you?" And he says, "Oh, I've got a job offer. I could go to this wonderful job in New York, but I really like my work here. I don't know my work here in Chicago. I don't know what to do. I can't decide." And his friend says, "Well, come on, hey, this is your research area. You work on this all the time. So just compute the expected benefits and the expected costs of the two alternatives, weigh them up against each other, and make your decision based on that cost-benefit analysis." And the guy turns to him and says, "But you don't understand. This is really serious." And that, I think, expresses nicely how such approaches can be a game and how we need something more serious. So the idea is, in my approach, that we start with the moments of confrontation with the natural world. And in Epiphanies chapter 4, I talk, for example, about the wonderful Scottish naturalist. The wonderful Scottish naturalist, I have no idea whether she's a nationalist or not, who talks in her book, The Cairngorms, Nan Shepherd. She talks in her book, The Cairngorms, about her own epiphanic experiences of being in the mountains and of sensing her smallness in that magnificent, vast environment. And that is an epiphany. That is a sense of understanding the beauty of what's around you and being drawn to it, and being drawn to see it as valuable and as something crucial to the world around you that you must protect and respond to and be in awe of, be in something like an attitude of worship towards. So philosophers have sometimes discussed the question, is anything sacred? Is there anything holy in the world? And I am enough of a fan of Wordsworth and the Romantics, and indeed Nan Shepherd, and of lots of people who've talked about environmental value, to think that the answer to that is yes. There are things that are sacred and holy in the world, and this isn't necessarily a religious point. It's a point of our common understanding that sublime natural beauty, supreme natural beauty, is something to which the appropriate response is awe, reverence, love, devotion, sometimes almost fear, and a sense that there's something here that we simply have to protect and to respond to. Now, that's an experience that we all have, and it's an experience that we don't need to be taught by complicated university courses in whatever school of ethical theory. It's an experience that we naturally have, and we are naturally drawn to the beauty of the world and to the wonderful, astonishing planet that we live in. I don't know which of us saw the aurora the other night. I've never seen them before, despite living in Scotland for the last 20 years, and despite being someone who, as a mountaineer who's rather slow and therefore often gets benighted, particularly in the winter months, I'm outside all the time, very often looking northwards at high latitudes, yet I'd never seen the aurora until the other night. And it was just astonishing. I was there on top of Dundee Law, our local extinct volcano. It's a bit like, which is to Dundee, a bit as Arthur's Seat is to Edinburgh. On top of Dundee Law, there was a traffic jam. There were hundreds of people. Everyone was there with their cameras, staring up at the sky, trying to photograph the astonishing colours, the amazing beauty that was all around us. And that was an experience that made me feel lots of things. I mean, there were people who just lying on their backs in the grass on top of Dundee Law, looking up at the skies. It's an experience that made me think lots of things. But one thing it made me think very strongly was there's hope for humanity. We're capable of seeing this kind of beauty. We're capable of responding to it. Despite everything else that's wrong in the world, there's hope for humanity if seeing the aurora borealis is something that can draw a crowd. So I haven't even begun to address the questions of implementation. I've only addressed the starting point, which is the fact of value around us and the fact of the human natural response to epiphanies. And that's just a starting point. But hey, I only had 12 minutes.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Sophie-Grace. That's very interesting. I think many of us enjoyed the Northern Lights and looking forward to perhaps some more Northern Light experience in the forthcoming few weeks. So that's something. So thank you very much indeed. Questions, ideas, lots of thought-provoking things going on. Can we hold those till we finished our three speakers? So I'd like now to introduce Maria Nita, talking about funeral rituals for the climate crisis. Thank you.
I'm lecturing in religious studies. My name is Maria Nita, and my research is about climate activism. And I've been doing research since 2007 as an ethnographer mainly, but also a cultural historian, looking at the climate movement, so the contemporary climate movement, but also looking at its roots and kind of roots through, particularly the global north. So I'm interested in the UK and kind of its European connections. I want to talk about ritual today and kind of try to get the two speakers think about the value of ritual and what it can bring to both activists and their publics, in this context of Imaginaries of environmentalism. And you can see from these images here that they kind of represent the kind of two main groups that I'm interested in. So I'm interested in green Christians involved in the climate movement, but I'm also interested in the climate movement more broadly. So those who are not necessarily affiliated or not declaredly, of particular religious traditions. They might be spiritual but not religious. They might be atheists. I did some quantitative research in the movement some 10 years ago, and I found that 50% of activists identified, or almost 50% of activists identified as non-religious. But they will still use many symbols, religious symbols, like funerary rituals, for instance, to explore issues of extinction and to engage with the climate crisis. So I'm really interested in looking at this, form of ritual as well, in connection with the idea of imaginary, and to what extent I want to think here, to what extent do we need a kind of degree of political and religious opportunity in order to really support this cultural and value change that we talk about in the case of environmentalism. And of course, because I've told you that I do a bit of historical research as well, I'm primarily an ethnographer, but I have done historical research into the 70s, and another decade that really interests me is the 90s, so the pagan, eco-pagan movement in particular. And I'm really interested in their experiments with new forms of participatory storytelling, ritual being or ritualized protest being a form of this experimentations, let's say. And, there is a discourse. My findings would indicate that there is a discourse there. In other words, it's not to say that a participant has complete freedom of exploration, like with everything else. There is a map to that territory, but I'm really interested in what happens, what model of participation is invoked, and what does it do to participants to explore this identity, like non-human identities, in this way. So in this picture here that you see called Council of All Beings, activists are wearing animal masks and they speak for the non-humans. So I'm really interested in understanding what happens in this ritual, what's their experience, and what exactly, like I said, what forms they draw on to take part in this, in these rituals or ritualized practices. And I have put together a conceptual framework for this. And you can find this article in my academia account, and it's called Inside Story. And I'm looking at the role of imagination in participating in this kind of exploratory practices. And what I found, and this is based on experience, ethnographic research with climate activists, with Christian activists mostly, but other non-Christians as well, is that they, there is let's say an emotional cathartic dimension that concludes the practice, and it's about reflection. It's about having a safe space for exploration and expressing emotions, and empathy for other than humans, and it's about a shift of perspective and identity. So I would say that these sort of practices are transformative. And I'm going to go deeper into what happens, how are they transformative. But the 4 steps, let's say, in these practices, whether they're rituals or not, are often, it's a reflective stage where activists are encouraged to prepare and reflect. Then they enter the new story, so the ritualized space, or the kind of experimental practice is furnished, let's say, with the meaning of a complete world, the story world. Then there is an opportunity to voice or speak on behalf of others, or often to let's say experience experiment with other ways of so often with silence even, so there may be let's say Eucharist in nature for Green Christians where they don't speak. The whole point of the ritual is that it's silent. Then there is also a stage of kind of embodying and relating to others and other objects in this kind of, let's say, fully furnished world of the ritual that I'm talking about. And I'm just going to show you one example. This is an Extinction Rebellion being a central network in the climate movement. And it's this month. This is some research that I've done at the beginning of this month in Bath, where they held, the Extinction Rebellion movement held one of the biggest gathering of red rebels, and there were 4,000 mourners altogether, holding or hosting a funeral for nature. That was the so-called order of service on the left, and you can see them on the streets of Bath. They really were, a sea of red on the streets of Bath, and processing, very powerfully processing this corpse that represented nature. Sorry, I'm just trying to go to the next. And I find it really interesting to see this kind of really intersection between religious and, let's say, public spheres, and how all sorts of religious practices like kneeling, and this is not only in the Extinction Rebellion movement, there are other activist movements that use this kind of embodied practices, to represent their kind of protest. I'm really interested in how this blurring of boundaries takes place between religious and the secular. And I know I've spoken now for 10 minutes, so I'm just going to try to summarize everything else that I was going to tell you in the next 10 minutes in 5 minutes, if that's okay, George. Is that too long? Am I taking too long here?
No, that's fine. That's fine, Maria. Do carry on.
All right. Okay, not more, not 1 second after.
Okay.
Thank you. And in fact, I have my timer here, you see, so I can make sure that that's the case. But yes, so like I said, I look at Christian climate activists as well, kind of doing this sort of protests and kind of exploratory practices. And this is a Green Christian protest, for instance, outside of the England's General Synod in London in February 2020. So they have different publics, the Church of England, the kind of unengaged public, and so on. And in this case, they are talking about the future victims of the climate crisis. So these are coffins of children who will be, who will die as a result of the climate crisis. Okay, so now I want to finish with just some reflections on ritual, and the kind of, like I said, just to match what the other two speakers talked about, the value or the point of it. And I want to show you here something that is a bit of a it's kind of a linchpin or ritual primer in the climate movement. It's called drowning in oil, and it's used a lot. It's simply, just as it sounds, it kind of involves drowning participants in oil, and it can be not only humans but non-humans, animals, seals, birds, and so on can be drowned in oil. In this case, we have also a kind of artistic, let's say, representation of this, what they was a protest at the National Gallery in London, and they were kind of in this almost I can't think of the word, but that it kind of created it created a really, this was the beginning of this sort of protest when I think that climate activists were not as kind of scrutinized for their, protests involving art or in art galleries. It's become increasingly more difficult to do this sort of thing now. Right. I just want to say a few words about ritual. So I think that what happens in this context of, there is let's say, a macro level and a micro level. It's this kind of what I said, this furnished world in which participants go. But there is also a way of, let's say, a semiotic level where there are, the ritual can go past language. Right, and it's simply an opportunity to use other systems of perception, like picture, sound, feelings, emotions, and both conscious and non-conscious material. And so the ritual has this power to take us into this ritualized world. And I think that. And with this, I will conclude. What I propose really is that we need to understand, by looking at this, rituals of the climate crisis, what happens. It's not just the story that we're told, because in a way, like the funerary rites are about memorialization, and I think that these rituals are not about memorialization. In fact, they are the opposite of memorialization. They're about extinction. So we can't look for a kind of, let's say, story analysis or language analysis in the way that we would normally understand it. So we have to look at what it does to the identity of the participants. And I think that in this space, we can see two things. First, we can see that there is story of empowerment through vulnerability, or a model of empowerment through vulnerability, which I think has Christian roots. And as such, it is very or it is easier to understand by a post-Christian, in a post-Christian context, and by a post-Christian audience. And also, I think that it's a way of challenging publics to, kind of transform their identity, because we have this, changes of polarity in this ritual space, and, challenging in a way, images that invites us, the others, the unengaged public, to really question what we're doing in the context of the crisis.